I think there's a touch of David's liberal views there. Liberal in the not in the left wing sense.
It's the Gladstonian liberal, yeah. Dave Cantrell. That's
yeah, but yeah, that's a strong view about, especially about the loan and the chances of it not being paid back. It's sort of been talked as a bridging loan whilst Argyle can get some liquid assets together, but there's the risk of it not being paid back.
Yeah, of course.
I suppose on the liquidity side of things, I can't remember if you did give your sort of take on that. We talked about that, didn't we, a bit?
A little bit. I mean, my point was that with liquidity, they needed to put sufficient revenue to one side. And yes, no one could have predicted a global pandemic. However, we have had months of knowing what the circumstances is. I think everyone knew what the circumstances were from early March, and anyone who was prudent would have been, putting some money under the mattress if you could. And it seems like Argyle is the kind of guy who could do that, unlike some, and he probably should have done. And certainly for the cost of $200,000, I think, it doesn't feel right from that point of view. 4 months is a reasonable amount of time to create some liquidity if that's what you needed to do.
Lee Whitnell said, really sad news. Anyway, my two-penneth is, listening to Professor Tony Collins, I often feel sad, angry and frustrated about the historical poor choices, missed opportunities and interference that has stunted the growth of rugby league and kept us comparatively poor to some of the other codes. It's not hard to imagine a successor to Professor Tony Collins in years to come, speaking about how rugby league paved the way for rugby union's expansion into North America, citing the Toronto experiment as the moment we let our own opportunities slip through our fingers. After forfeiting the season, on top of their financial shenanigans, there's not much anyone can do to save them in Super League, which is a shame, because if they go under, there are 7,000 to 10,000 new rugby fans over there in an international metropolis with a huge long-term potential that will be ripe for the picking. Any Heartlands RL fans gloating now need to give their heads a wobble. I'm a marketer, so I've approached it from that angle, but I also feel desperately sad for the Toronto fans. That's one thing I'm not sure if I conveyed enough last week, because we were just trying to deal with it as best we could. But how sad the whole thing and the whole mess does make me feel too. So I'd appreciate some of the things Lee's saying there about feeling sad for people and that sort of stuff. But the 7,000 to 10,000 new rugby fans, it's something that keeps coming up, that they keep referring to it as rugby, not rugby league. Argyle and Bob Hunter and people. And also when you talk to guys like Henry and Scott, and they say when people go to the games and they're then saying, where can we go and play this game, they'll be able to say, well, I know that there's a kids rugby union team that play, so it's not exactly the same game, but it's similar enough that you'll learn the basics. And then hopefully by the time your kids become teenagers, there's amateur rugby league teams for them to go and play for. Because that's kind of the reality still. So what Lee's saying is, it is right. This is right. There is a real threat of rugby union taking any positive growth of rugby that Toronto has achieved will maybe all be the fruits of that will be borne by rugby union potentially.
Yeah.
Because I believe the rugby union team is part of or very closely linked to the Maple Leaf Sports Enterprises. I can't remember what the guys told me. I can't remember. It was so complicated who's who. But anyway, there's a real opportunity for rugby league to miss out to rugby union in North America because of things like this. I agree with that point. Whether or not people care about that is a different matter.
Yes, and that's the problem, isn't it? I think Lee, yourself, we look at it as we look at the opportunities that it presents. It depends if you're a zero-sum game kind of proponent or not, and whether you believe that the pie can be enough for everybody, because we can just make a bigger pie, or whether you believe it's a pie that's getting smaller and smaller every year, and we just need to protect our slice. I think
Alan talks a bit about that, doesn't he? Actually, sort of.
He does. Yes,
not you, Alan. Alan Walker, Alan.
Yeah, in his own unique way. So. And so Alan Walker says, as I've said, any decision on Toronto needs to be made soon, because all clubs in all leagues need to know where they are as soon as possible. Whatever the rights and wrongs are, finances at all clubs dictate need some kind of stability given COVID and rugby league poverty. 2021 is a World Cup year in a busy telemarket, and this mess needs to be cleaned up ASAP. If they leave the decision for later, it'll only get messier. When Toronto started in League One, it seemed a one-off, a novelty, typical rugby league, outside the box. Now there's a growing queue in the US and Canada. There's a possibility of one club a year joining the structure at League One. If promotion and relegation continues and these clubs continue to join, the likes of Leigh, Fev, etc., could be pipped for promotion for the next don't know how many years. Not only will many clubs and fans get pissed off in the Championship, it could soon start impacting the likes of Cass, Wakey, Salford, Hull KR, etc., as less affluent clubs get relegated and American clubs get promoted. Is that the plan? We end up with the big clubs plus American teams, half the away games across the pond. Any punishment to Toronto doesn't improve the possibilities of smaller English teams. It just delays the above. When Super League teams like Hull KR or Broncos get relegated recently and come back up, people said it works. Never mind what the owners lost, that the employers got sacked, etc. Okay, I accept promotion and relegation in a small geography. Hull KR can play other clubs you can cycle into in a lower league. But once the league is more international, that looks and is stupid. Say you relegate Toronto, Championship or League One clubs budgeting for a promotion push suddenly face themselves up against Toronto and much bigger resources. 10,000 rich hipster fans. Let's buy SBW and DCE, RTS, etc., etc.
Who's FU2?
Toronto. I don't know.
No, I don't. Anyway, go on.
Fooey, maybe. I don't know. Toronto is always in the top 10 cities to live in, and when they're playing Leigh, with all due respect, which always means no respect. But see, what Alan's talking about there is he's looking at it in 2030, and I don't think any of the rugby league chairmen even think about 2030. Never mind plan for it. I really don't, and this is the issue we have about lack of strategic thinking, and that kind of goes back to Leigh's point as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, this is total left field point, but next year we've got Brazil playing in the women's section of the League World Cup.
Yep.
For example, if the NRL
and Canada.
aren't already thinking, and Canada. But thinking about Brazil particularly, kind of slightly isolated, if the NRL aren't already thinking about how you can link Brazil with their teams, then they're missing out. Just as an example, these are kind of things that you need to be thinking about in the longer term potential market for the game. And I just think, unfortunately, many of our chair people just don't think long term, and it holds us back, unfortunately.
Well, I think another thing we don't necessarily think is whole game, and I think Nicholas kind of makes a point that to me shows a little bit of the naivety sometimes of some of the Toronto North American based fans about how things work over here. Not that I'm saying things work how they should work necessarily, I'm not saying the rights and wrongs here, I'm just saying there's a naivety to how things work. So Nicholas said, quoting what we said last week, what if another club withdraws in the future? By saying that, it fails to mention whether that would be under the circumstances of months-long lockdown during a pandemic, massively different than just picking and choosing what games a team wants to play. Feeling sorry for a club that ceases to exist, as you mentioned, is incredibly different here. You lose a club in the UK and you have others nearby at all levels. Losing the only pro club here threatens the sport itself. This is much bigger than a club not playing. And that kind of wraps up into what you were saying, but the naivety there is that Nicholas thinks that every rugby league fan is a fan of rugby league first. They're not. People who go to watch Castleford or Hull Kingston Rovers or Wigan, hometown people that go and watch their hometown side, they go and watch that because they've always gone and watched that. They love the sport because they love their team, not the other way round. Now, I'm a bit different because I'm not from a rugby league town, even though I'm only from 40 minutes up the road. It's not a rugby league town, not a rugby league area, so I have a slightly different perspective that I probably love the sport first and my team second, and I wouldn't stop supporting the sport if my team went out of existence. But there's a lot of people who maybe would just switch on the BBC for the internationals, but that's their only involvement in rugby league if their small town team went by the wayside. And a lot of these fans do think that North American clubs, like in the model Alan's sort of suggesting, with the promotion and relegation involved and stuff like that, will just be there to usurp their small town club. The parochial element of how it works. It's to someone, even if you've got 10 clubs within 50 miles, you'll still feel like you've lost more by losing your club because your club's been there for all of this time than someone who's only just supported the sport for a few years might feel about losing their club. But the loss for the person who's only just known about the sport is they're losing the sport for them. It's a different mindset, and I think there's a naivety there sometimes about that mindset. Yeah. And you might call it small-minded, you might call it backwards thinking, or whatever you might want to call it, but it's a reality, and we have to find a way of finding a structure and a way forward for our sport that combines both those two elements without losing anything. Because if you lose all those northern towns that play the sport, where are your players coming from in reality? And this goes back to like expansion needs to be involved in development as well, like you say, Alan, because in reality Toronto's produced no players, but Castleford, Wigan, Hull, Leeds, I know Leeds is a city, Hull's a city, so that may be a bad example. St Helens, Wigan, Castleford, Featherstone, they produce players. Half of the players in Super League are produced through the systems in Wigan, St Helens and Widnes, right? And half of them are produced through Leeds and Hull and Castleford, what have you. But who's going? If those clubs disappear because of other clubs coming in, you don't just go and support Lee. It's not how it works.
No, it's not.
It's not, and that's reality. However, there is some sense to what Nicholas is saying about, we need to have a plan to protect the sport itself, which is bigger than the teams, certainly. But you have to realise that for most of the supporters of the teams, the team is bigger than the sport, and that's why so many fans hate the RFL. In terms of what happens if another club withdraws in the future, well, every club would say they have circumstances. So I think we need to stop getting our head so focused and fixated on this being such a dire circumstance. Not that it isn't, and not that it's not awful, but there's more awful things happening than rugby league clubs stopping playing for half a season or whatever around the world right now. Much more worse stuff. But ultimately, there's other significant circumstances that people can cite, and once you start setting precedents, where do you draw the line? So say Ken Davey dies, but he hasn't put any sort of trust aside for the Huddersfield Giants. So the person who backs the Huddersfield Giants dies. There's no money directed to the club. It would require one of his children to want to take over running the club and funding the club for anything over the central funding they get, right? That is a massive circumstance. And if Huddersfield withdrew from the competition because of that, it's not a deadly pandemic that's affecting the whole world, but it's a deadly issue that's affecting the Huddersfield Giants. And would everyone be saying, nah, just let them back in next year with new owners? They wouldn't. They'd say relegate them because they've not completed the season because they pulled out because no one's paying the players' wages. Now Ken Davies died. That theoretically could happen. So we can't